Welcome to Are You Ready Australia? The Future of Indigenous Leadership in Australian Higher Education, a conference developed by Poche SA+NT and facilitated by Campus Morning Mail and Twig Marketing. I'm Tim Winkler, and firstly I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we each live and work today. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This session is Voice to Higher Education, Opportunities for First Nations Representation in the Sector. While Australia has been discussing a long-awaited Voice to Parliament, the panel is going to talk about the opportunities for a voice in higher education and what that might look like. Feel free to ask questions through the Q&A area at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to include as many of them as we can. Now, on our panel today, we have Conference Chair, Associate Professor Marie Meredith, who's Director of Poche SA+NT, Professor Simone Ter, the PVC Indigenous at Flinders University, and we'll also shortly be joined by Professor Tom Karma AO, the Chancellor of the University of Canberra. Simone, can we start with you and talk about, do we need a voice, given that the nation is looking at the concept of a voice to Parliament? What about a voice in higher education? Do we need a formal voice, or is there already a voice there?
I think it's a really good question, and it's a really pivotal time, I think, in our country as we move towards a referendum for a voice to Parliament. I think in the sector, there are a number of representative groups that are also contributing to Indigenous higher education and higher education more broadly. And so that those particular groups, which I've been part of as well, is the National Aboriginal Torres Under Higher Education Consortium, NATSIC, which is a non-representative group that has those critical conversations about where we see higher education into the future, what are some of our key priorities, how we directly provide submissions to key initiatives like ERA in terms of the recent excellent research Australia ranking and the benchmarking, which we know is on hold at the moment. So that's happening at a national level. In terms of representation, particularly to sort of core bodies like University Australia, and as you'd be aware, we do have an Indigenous strategy by UA 2022 to 2025. The DVCA's Indigenous, PVC's Indigenous also directly meet with the UA, the executive of the UA. So there are these structures that are in place. Internally, locally within our own university context at Flinders University, I actually think having governance and leading Indigenous governance within the university is actually critical and pivotal. I think we should be leading some of these conversations around representation, around what are our localised priorities, but how they feed into the ecosystem of national priorities. Whether we're asking for a voice that is similar to what's being proposed in relation to the voice to Parliament in a university context, I think that's a conversation we should be having, whether we think that is the way we want to go as a sector, given we do have some of these sort of national structures already, and some of these have been around for quite a while. NATSIC has been around for quite a while. Obviously, the DVC, PVC Alliance group, which meets with the University of Australia, is more recent, as we've had more PVCs and DVCs actually at that senior management level. Fundamentally, though, what I do think is First Nations peoples have something to contribute profoundly to the sector. And so having our voices in a range of capacities, I think, is really important. And as I've been in the role for 3 years now as PVC Indigenous, what's very clear to me is that we have the capacity to lead these conversations and also support the university to direct Indigenous engagement.
Marie, Simone's touched on a number of really interesting points there in terms of the structures that are already in place and a growing number of PVCs in the sector. Do you see a momentum for change, and are there more opportunities for Aboriginal voices to be heard?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Just want to pick up on Professor Simone-Tua's comment around governance. We have got strong representation in our communities. So I think the way forward for universities is to embrace and support their staff and students internally, but it's also the partnership with community that's going to be really important. So when we talk about voices, we also want to create a space, a safe space where those voices can be heard. And so the role of the institution then is to create the space, but hold the space so that community, mob and community voices can be heard clearly. And we also need to recognise that, there is such diverse voices. So the role of our institutions is to ensure that, one, the voices are coming in. Two, how do those voices then start to support our staff internally and our issues and our priorities in terms of Indigenising the curriculum? We've already made headway, in terms of the university and their governance structures. For instance, most universities have a RAP. So here we're talking about key principles where the RAP has provided the foundations to understand what cultural leadership is about. What does it mean to have inclusive participation? And of course, respect for long-term partnerships. These are all the sorts of, themes that are coming through the voice, but they're themes that we've started to examine under our own RAP processes. Again, it's about transparency, it's about accountability, but at the end of the day, the university is in the business of evidence. And so what are the evidence-based decision-making models? So from an academic point of view, that's going to be really critical. So we're looking very closely at what the co-design model is or models are, and what does a community-led design process look like. These are terms that are being used at the moment in the university and higher education sector, but are we talking about the same thing? So this is where the voice will be able to help us to really unpack, the voice, co-design, community-led initiatives, but at the same time, bringing in those community voices. So from my point of view, they are the key priorities for us.
Fantastic. Now, we're joined also now by Tom Karma. Tom, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Tim.
We're having a great conversation about the voices within the higher education sector. And as we're talking about a voice to Parliament, do we need more voices within the sector, talking to the sector and talking beyond that? Now, you're in a distinctive position as being often, you've had to be the lone voice, the lead voice throughout your career. You've had many hats, currently Australia's first Indigenous Chancellor. And also, most recently, the ACT Senior Australian of the Year, I believe. So congratulations for that too. Another recognition of your career. But from your experience, what are the challenges of bringing Indigenous voices to the fore for the sector?
Yeah, look, it's a really big question, and thanks, Tim, and hi fellow panelists, two old buddies, but yeah, can I begin by saying that I'm coming in from Canberra on Ngunnawal country and pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people online today and recognise all of your country around the nation. Yeah, look, it is, and just to correct you, I'm not the first Indigenous Chancellor. Pat O'Shane was at Uni New England for a number of years. I'm the first male, so which is still something to be very proud of, and something that we're very conscious, and I continually put pressure on my other university colleagues to start to think about this. I think the voice is very, very important, and there's quite a number of layers to this, and I just picked up the tail end of what Marie was saying, and I think that if anybody gets the opportunity to have a look at the final report and the interim report that Professor Marcia Langton and I did on the co-design process, there's some really good guidance in there about what co-design is about, and it's about the principles. We also articulate a whole range of principles that need to be considered in a co-design or a meaningful interaction with community and a respectful interaction. So when I look at this question, I see it from 3 levels. In fact, one is governance, which is so important. And, as you mentioned, I'm the only, Indigenous Chancellor. But it goes beyond that, because there are not enough Indigenous people in universities, on their senates and governing councils. And we need to really encourage more and more to get up. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in academia to start to nominate and start to identify people who might really service the institution, well, and start to nominate them through our various internal channels, so that they come on the radar in selections. And on that, where there are student and staff representatives, elected representatives on the councils and senates, we need to encourage our colleagues to put their hand up and nominate, because I can tell you it's a very rewarding experience to be at that level, if you can get voted in, and also start to target some of our students and say, look, join the Student Representative Council. Make sure that you're part of the process, not just a passive participant in being a student, but you can also have an influence throughout the whole governance of that university. And that's where it's that governance level that gives the direction. And when we worked at Flinders on the RAP, developing the RAP, it was ownership from the highest level down to the student and the community level. And that was so important. And that's another good example of co-design and how we went through that process overall. So that's the first level. The second one is looking at our academy, and we don't have enough Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander either full-time or fractional staff across universities. We need to get more. It's probably hovering close to 1,500 across all the institutions, but some are very well represented, others aren't. And so we need to make sure that we encourage more and more people to think about engagement. And at that academic level also, we need our Indigenous academics to get a lot more active in publications and grants, because from an academics perspective, that's where it all works and it all counts, and you're measured on that. And and I get on the opportunity to get on a number of selection panels around the nation, and both for Indigenous and non-Indigenous faculty, and there is a stark difference in the number of publications. And what we're moving towards is being the first author, because we're down as co-authors a lot, which is great, but a lot of that is with our own mob. We're going to break into getting the non-Indigenous academics to have us down as authors and lead authors in a number of these publications, but also in grant applications. And that's the other big one that counts. And I know that people, we're party to grants and grant applications, and because we don't get up in the first time we do it, don't think that should be the end of it. You've got to continually do it. And there's now opportunities where more and more institutions are through the research areas are developing training programs to be able to fill in grant applications and to know where to target. But we know that. But all I do is encourage people to start to look at that pathway, because to be able to advance through the sector, and we don't want everybody at level C's or seniors, we want them up to level E's and so forth, and we can do it and there's, you know, a number of us are already around the nation, but you know, there needs to be a lot more, and that's when you get a lot more portability of that qualification at that level E level. So and of course the third one is down to the student cohort, and I mentioned that briefly, but we need to work on getting more and more students engaged in the universities to build the cohort, and it is improving. But, you know, we're at a good place, and I think that's part of what your question was, you know, are we ready to do that? And I think we are. The current government has really got some and articulated some strong equity targets now, and it's not only for our mob, but for low socioeconomic called communities, and we all experience often very common, you know, predicaments that restrict our access to universities. But we need to look at building that student cohort and to progress them through, not only just to complete a bachelor's, but, you know, to go on to honours and then that transition onto you know, the new and we're doing really good in you know, the number of people that have completed PhDs, but we can do a lot more, and the demand is going to be out there. And, you know, the Accord, and I urge everybody, when the Accord gets announced in another week or so, you know, to have a look at it and understand what that University Accord is trying to achieve. It's really establishing a process to develop the Accord. The Accord won't be out, but you'll see in there some very clear targets of what needs to be achieved. And we can't be passive in this. We need to get up front and make sure that our say is heard. And you know, we got that through the, you know, the PVC group and NIHEC and so forth. So we need to just keep on exerting that. But look, that's it. And of course, the other big challenge, and we do this through the RAP, is with the community and get them on board and get them to understand, because that's the feeder group to students, to academics, and particularly at the governance level.
That's very comprehensive, Tom, covering those three areas. You set it out really clearly. Just on that last point on community, can I just ask you a bit further? And this is a question to I think maybe to everyone on the panel. How far have we come with community? I think we have probably made some great progress, but have we still got a way to go?
I think we do, and it varies. You can't, you know, this is the worst thing we can do is try and homogenise what's happening across the nation, because it does vary, you know, quite a bit. And some of our institutions, a good number now, have got elders in residence and have you know, an interaction with the community. But I think the Voice to Parliament exercise is a, you know, fantastic opportunity for universities to get involved. And I've done a number of speeches about this recently, and talk about we need to be inward focused, and that is to make sure that our staff, our students all understand about what the Voice to Parliament is about and what the referendum's about, and the process of getting involved. But outwardly focused is really when we work with the community. And as a university, we have a role to help educate the community, engage with the community, and get them to understand. And like at the University of Canberra, through one of our Ngunnawal elders, you know, she's stepped up, and you know, we've already had a couple of community meetings, and she's now organising for the community, which are predominantly non-Indigenous people, to come together on a very regular basis to talk through and understand, because it's the non-Indigenous population who's going to carry the vote on the referendum, not our 4%. It's the 96% of the, you know, the non-Indigenous population who are going to be voting. So you know, we're in a great position, and there's all those spin-offs. Once we start to develop that relationship on something like The Voice, you know, that maintains a relationship. They get to understand a lot more about us and what we can do. And yeah, but I know, you know, as a fact that I hear this on you know, quite a number of universities, that they need to understand a bit more about The Voice. And in fact, later on this afternoon, where Simone and I are at is the Innovative Research Universities forum we're hosting at UC, I'll be giving a speech about this, about the voice and how universities can be engaged in that process.
I'd really like to, I think, Professor Uncle Tom, what you said is really resonates with me. I do think as in higher education is a space of knowledge production and research. And so I think we do have a fundamental role as part of an educational campaign about how we inwardly support the university community, that's both student and staff community, to understand what the voice to Parliament means. For many people who haven't lived through a referendum before, so even what a referendum is. And so these are the roles I think we should be, and hopefully into the future we'll be having some forums to be able to promote this in Flinders. Next week we're actually having for Uncle Lewis Yellowburka's oration, which Tom, you gave the first oration in 2020. We'll be having, yes, you were the first to honour Uncle Lewis, and so next week we'll be having Minister Kai Ma talk about sort of the localised state-based initiatives around voice, treaty and so forth. So I really agree with you. I also think around truth-telling, the other part that I think higher education institutions can play a role in is the way that knowledge production has been represented through research. And so actually really, it's not just about our truth-telling, it's about institutions that also have been sites of colonialism and continue to be, actually having that conversation, that complex conversation about their role. And I think truth-telling needs to be able to, so I'm not saying it should all be negative, but what I'm saying is that we also need to encourage the non-Indigenous community to understand truth-telling and what that means from a site of knowledge production, where we know the representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have often been undertaken in the main by non-Indigenous researchers, but then how we can, how those perspectives can be looked at. I also, the other last thing I just wanted to add around truth, I think it's really important that as we undertake this process that there is that safety involved, because telling truth often means sharing trauma. And so then how do we not have this process at the expense of our trauma or the cost of our trauma? So then how does that cultural safety part become as part of that conversation? And that truth-telling can also be restorative. It actually can be something that makes change and positive change. So they're the things I'm sort of thinking about as we think to bring these discussions into the university space about how do we balance all those things, but what are the role of the institutions as part of their truth-telling?
Yeah. Simone, can I just say, and you'll hear me talk about this afternoon, but for the benefit of everybody else, is that we need to be really conscious at the moment of not conflating what the Uluru Statement was calling for, and that's voiced truth and treaty, and what the referendum's about. The referendum is only about the voice, and it's only about Commonwealth legislation. And it's very, very clearly defined. And so, we can talk about the three of them, but we need people to understand, because already we're getting feedback, that people are all worried about voting positively in the referendum because they think it's about treaty, and it's about, and with treaty comes losing land and all this sort of crap. But, which is all not factual anyhow. So if we can just define it to saying that, that's what the referendum's about.
Yeah, I think that's really useful, Uncle Tom, particularly I think that's what that education campaign becomes really important, to understand what referendums and this very distinct purpose. Because I was at Barumpa the week before last, the First Nations conference, and there was complex conversations around all those components. So I can see how those comments are coming in to the community discourse, and so I think that clarity of the purpose of the referendum is really important, because I'm hearing this stuff out in the community. So so those messagings are critical.
Marie, I've got a question that follows on from both of those comments, which is there's already some positive and negative vibes and discourse about the referendum, and how do you balance getting voices in universities to come forward with the challenges of being sometimes a lone voice or sometimes a minority voice in a political debate, as in terms of welfare of staff and preservation of voices?
Yeah, good question, Tim. I think from a practical point of view, it's really incumbent on the university to provide the opportunity to continue the conversation, a dialogue, and initiatives like this online platform, as well as webinars. You know, these are a great practical, cost-effective way to actually, you know, hold a space and to be able to bring everybody together. And that's not just Aboriginal mob and Torres Strait Islander mob, that's everybody, you know. So I think the more we can have these conversations, the more people are going to want to be involved. And what it also does too, Tim, is it overcomes the fear, you know, of actually having or asking a question. And this is exactly what this, you know, this initiative is about, is to actually, you know, make sure that the community and staff and students are across the issues, are across the debates. But most importantly, this is actually about providing a space that everybody can have a conversation where it's culturally safe. So from a practical point of view, more and more of these initiatives should be done, because that's what's going to break down the barriers, the fear, but also this is actually about, you know, everybody being informed what the issues and the debates are about. So, you know, from a community perspective, from a university perspective, you know, this is where we can be doing more work on a practical basis.
I've got another question to each of you, which is you're all sort of fearless leaders and out there and happy to make you know, comments in a public domain, but what about you know, perhaps your level A, level B young researchers who are starting, or professional staff who might have a more quiet disposition but perhaps still want to be heard? How do you create a space where you encourage those people to come forward?
So from my perspective, I mean, Flinders has just come out of a First Nations Researchers Collective Summit. That's where, so this is looking at particularly academic staff and research higher degree students. And the idea of the collectivity was actually with the intent to have both level A right through to level A engagement and research higher degree students. The critical part to this particular collective which Marie was part of last week as well, is about actually developing a culturally safe environment, but allowing for rigorous engagement and discussion as well. And I think really leaders have to model this. I think we need to model. I think we need to provide different, alternative and different and multiple ways of having conversations. So it can be, you know, through webinars, it can be through you know, a number of presentations, but it might be that we have smaller collective type of conversations and engagements. So I think we've got to provide all the facets and opportunities for conversation. It doesn't always have to be in big rooms. It can be in smaller ways as well. I think you need really good facilitation though to allow those conversations to continue in a safe way. I think, you know, level A's have a lot to offer right through to research high degree students. So I think our community, our research community, our staff, students come with a whole lot of knowledge as well. So they're not deficit in being able to offer those perspectives and opinions, but it's the way that we can facilitate that so multiple voices are heard.
Simone, can I just follow up on that just before we go to Tom, because there was a question through the collective was only for Flinders. It would be nice to see across more universities, so many of us in isolation, level B at Deakin here.
Yes, that's a really good comment. And I'm actually sitting, as Uncle Tom said, at the IRU senior staff forum, where I'm going to be leading a panel on the IRU newly launched strategy, which is actually looking at an Indigenous academy, research academy for the IRUs. So I think, and sorry, I'm not sure, I don't think Deakin's part of that, but I absolutely agree. You know, there are some really good models out there in relation to how we can bring the idea of collectivity together. This is going to be one model. We're going to be strategizing, having conversations about what this could look like. Look, and I'm a product of NERICAN, the National Indigenous Research Knowledges Network, which was a special SRI in 2012. Marie, you were part of that as well.
Yeah.
So, I feel like I've been nurtured and mentored kind of to grow up in a sense and be supported around research engagement about what it means to be an Aboriginal academic. I started as a level A, I'm now a level E. So how do you do that? So I absolutely agree. NERICAN, I think, was an incredible way to demonstrate bringing all academics and researchers into the space. So hopefully those models can sort of, be picked up by other universities as well.
Yeah. Tom, did you have any thoughts on how it could work better across the sector? Because that's a particularly sort of poignant question from the audience.
Yeah, well, it is important, and NERICAN was very, very good, and was really a kickstart, and also engaged those non-formal researchers, those who work with us but aren't necessarily an academic researcher, which was good. The health academics have got together, and we've got a really significant network now that's being established. And we got that through an NH&MRC grant to get established. And I think that's the sort of model that we need to look at, maybe for some of the other disciplines where there are big cohorts of people. And I think that's important. My only message is, and because within institutions, we also have Indigenous, research forums and also Indigenous staff forums, which are all good and really important, and they're the opportunities to be in a safe environment and to understand. But the only danger I see with that is that we don't want to marginalise ourselves within the institution. We've also got to be able to step out and work with all our non-Indigenous academics. And I talk a lot about in forums at universities about I'm in a very fortunate position. I'm on the Australian Medical Research Advisory Board, which sets the priorities around all health research and the strategy. So we've got influence there, and what we're moving towards, and we're encouraging universities, and particularly those universities who do, and they provide their own money for non-Indigenous researchers to research Indigenous issues. And yet they don't always include Indigenous people or Indigenous community in it, other than being the people being researched. And we're really working on trying to ensure that there is a far better partnership in these processes. And in fact, down the track, it could be down to the stage that if you don't have Indigenous researchers in some of these projects, you won't become eligible. That's not there yet, but that's the sort of thinking that we've been exploring. And I'm the only, Indigenous person on it. So we've got a lot of support from non-Indigenous people as well. But just don't marginalise ourselves and recognise that we need to, that's the only way we're going to be able to assert ourselves is if we're in these forums where the non-Indigenous researchers are.
Marie, we're amazing conversation. We're heading towards the end of the session now. Are there any closing thoughts that you have about the voice, about the way research is structured, and about bringing people along and helping people be less isolated?
Well, I think, with Uncle Tom's comments around, the co-design model, I think that's going to be really important to keep an eye on what those principles are in terms of, the cultural leadership is going to be absolutely critical. These are the issues that we're exploring in the institution. As Simone has said, we've now got our elders on campus. We've got those conversations happening with orations. And I think those kinds of conversations and initiatives are going to be leading our institutions into the future. I think it's also really important that any initiatives need to be backed up with evidence. So if there's any opportunity for Aboriginal people to be involved in research and to be involved in, you know, understanding what those decision-making models look like and how effective they are is always going to be really important, not just from a research perspective, but also policy, you know. So as Indigenous academics, we don't just do research, but we want to inform policy as well, you know. So
Yes.
really that's where we need to be moving as a collective, but at the same time, we do want our non-Indigenous counterparts with us. So my hope for the future is that, you know, these conversations that we're having online, perhaps the next conference will be a more broader conversation with our non-Indigenous colleagues around these very important issues.
Simone, did you have any closing thoughts?
I think, yeah, my final thought really is about capacity. And I think Uncle Tom picked up that in relation to, you know, we have specific initiatives at Flinders, like the First Nations Researchers Collective. And, you know, that is really around bringing in community. We also brought Nullumboy cultural educators and advisors into those conversations who are actually engaging with clinical practice and around Indigenous knowledges and cultural translation. But I also agree, one of the initiatives we thought that was important about the capacity of our staff. So we have 3 Indigenous leads, and that is about capacity for future leadership. So to me, that's one strategy. That strategy then supports our future leadership to actually engage in those conversations at Academic Centre, Indigenous research, in the research strategy. If I think more recently around the ERA, as I mentioned just when at the beginning of when I spoke, one of the things that we did here at Flinders is that whilst we didn't necessarily know what we were doing, we were learning as we were going. We actually were being led through the process, but also leading the process around ethics and so forth, around what our future submission for the Indigenous Studies Code could be. That was about leading, but also capacity building our knowledge, you know, around what it means for the ERA. What does it mean to benchmark? What does world ranking mean? You know, just that knowledge capacity and translation that, you know, we perhaps weren't as familiar with, but now we're actually building that collective capacity and knowledge so we can have those conversations also in those broader meetings and respective, you know, committees and even through policy submission. So for me, capacity building is critical, both inward and outward. I think there's times where we actually can have inward conversations and, you know, strategize our thinking, determine what we need and where we want to be, and then those outward engagements is just as critical.
And Tom, any last thoughts from you? This will be the start, or, you know, one of many conversations in the lead up to the launch of the Accord and beyond.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think we should all feel very proud that we're working within a university and that we can have influence on the future and our children of the future who are coming through. It's a very important and responsible role. It's also incumbent that we broaden our knowledge beyond just our disciplines. And, you know, as we've talked earlier, you know, there's a great opportunity to interface with the community who look up, you know, at what we do. Because we are institutions that practice free speech, there's always going to be, you know, difference of opinions on any one topic. But, you know, when we look at the mainstream media, there's a handful only at the national level of Indigenous academics who put themselves out, you know, on programs. And we need to, you know, expand that through community radio, community stations, you know, get ourselves out there. And, you know, we've got so much to offer and you know, the academy is growing. We're health, you know, I think from my observations around the nation is leading the way within the university sector. And, you know, we've got to try and broaden that out into some of the other disciplines. But for example, you know, Poche in Melbourne will support any, you know, PhD student across any institution if they're doing a health discipline. And they do all of this development work that we're, you know, that Simone and Marie have talked about. You know, there's those sort of forums that are around, and we need to take advantage of that and yeah, work together. But you know, we've got some great programs. So this is how do we build us as an academy in you know, to get the esteem that we need to have within institutions. And I think through the Accord and, you know, through UA's you know, Indigenous strategy, we're getting there. But you know, that requires all of us. It can't be just a few leading it at the top. We've all got a role to play, and just encourage everybody to get involved and, you know, reach out if you know, support is needed. There's, you know, many of us are willing to, you know, to share our knowledge and capacity.
Well, that's a truly inspiring note to leave it on. Thank you so much, Simone, Marie and Tom, for your contributions. I found that a most intriguing discussion and really, really super informative. So great start to the conference. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank
See you.
you. See you later.